Good morning, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. We anticipate a full room, so we'll probably have folks sort of wandering in as we get going. So I'm Danny Fallon. I am the chair of the Department of Mental Health here in the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins. And I have the privilege of helping to lead a department that houses the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse. And that has been indeed a great privilege, and this is my second year getting to start us all off, which is also really fun for me. And I have to say that the center, in addition to the role it plays in our department and our school, has a very special place in my heart in its approach. I am an autism epidemiologist, and so my work in the context of public health and autism has really focused, and our center's focus is on thinking about how to prevent autism or how to prevent the consequences of folks who are on the spectrum, as opposed to solely focusing on the treatment once someone has autism. And this idea of if you could stem the tide and prevent things from ever occurring, you really could make an impact that is quite meaningful. And that's not to diminish the importance of folks who really think about and push the treatment envelope as well. I think those are important goals simultaneously. But I'm happy to see folks that pay attention to this concept of prevention, and particularly in the setting in which the Moore Center has done this.
At the end of the day, I hope that you, like us, will leave with the sense that child sexual abuse is not inevitable, that it is it's a preventable public health problem. And toward that, I'm going to describe a little bit about some of the work you'll hear that the center is conducting to move us forward, to change the conversation from inevitability to prevention. You will hear speakers talk about our prevention research and some of our policy endeavors. With respect to prevention, Dr. Tamar Mendelson will describe our efforts to develop a parent-focused program to encourage the healthy sexual behavior of children starting at a young age. Dr. Cindy Schaefer will describe our efforts to develop a school-based prevention program aimed at all 12 and 13-year-old students and their parents. And I will describe a collaboration aimed at developing a prevention intervention for adolescents who are sexually attracted to young children. And I'm delighted that Luke Malone, a journalist who wrote about such adolescents for This American Life, joins us to present on his award-winning journalism and reporting, and also joins us to moderate a panel with a couple of very brave young men who are attracted to young children and committed to never acting on those attractions. With respect to our policy work, Dr. Andrew Harris will describe a project that we've designed to better understand the actual effects of juvenile sex crime policies. And Dr. Ryan Shields, my friend and colleague at the Moore Center, will describe a newly funded project in which we are examining the impact of state safe harbor policies that aim to shield juvenile victims from sex trafficking charges. We are, of course, mindful of the many effects that child sexual abuse has on victims and even on offenders. And Dr. Candice Firing will describe her work on the effects of child sexual abuse on children's compensatory behaviors. And our colleague and Symposium co-host, Dr. Fred Berlin, will present a case report on an individual whose own victimization played a role in his later offending behaviors. Our symposium ends fittingly with comments from our center's founding donor, Dr. Stephen Moore, who will describe why he and his family are committed to the prevention of child sexual abuse. It is my hope that by the end of the day, you are convinced that child sexual abuse is an entirely preventable public health problem and that you will join us in our prevention efforts.
This morning, I'm going to focus my remarks on children and youth with sexual behavior problems. And I'm going to talk about our work at OJJDP to help those young people and their child victims. A recent study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association specifically looked at whether childhood sexual abuse predicts subsequent sexual offending. The researchers found that children with histories of abuse and neglect were at increased risk for being arrested for sex crimes. However, they also found that individuals with a history of child sexual abuse were not at unique risk to be arrested for a sex crime compared with other physically abused or neglected individuals or matched control individuals. Put more simply, all children who are abused and neglected face increased risk of committing future crimes, including sex crimes, and all those children should receive appropriate intervention. I'm proud to say that our office promotes both programs and research to assist both of these overlooked and underserved populations. For instance, we are currently funding a program that includes support for project sites as well as training and technical assistance. The program features funding and includes one tribal site. And because of its dual focus on addressing and reducing victimization and problematic behavior, the program has enormous potential. At each of the sites, multidisciplinary teams, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, will develop community-based integrated services for youth with sexual behavior problems, their victims, and their families. Ultimately, the program aims to develop approaches that will help families and professionals recognize and respond to sexual behavior problems, rather than deny and minimize them. Early, effective, coordinated services will mean more and better treatment options. The program also includes an evaluation component so that OJJDP can measure the effectiveness of the project sites and determines if this approach should be replicated in other communities. It is vital that we use treatment approaches that are appropriate for youth, approaches which are very different from those used with adult sex offenders. First, any effort to treat youth with sexual behavior problems must be based on the well-documented fact that juvenile sex offenders have more in common with other youth in the juvenile justice system than they do with adult sex offenders. That is why treatment based on adult models have been largely unsuccessful. Any treatment used with youth must be developmentally appropriate and take into consideration the unique aspects of youthful offenders, including, and this is very important, potential previous victimization, inherent impulsivity, and their incredible capacity for rehabilitation. Teenagers are different from adults. I mean that literally. Children and adolescents are biologically wired differently than adults. They have trouble regulating their feelings, have a heightened sensitivity to peer pressure, and don't fully understand the implications of their decisions or actions. Therefore, in the juvenile justice system and elsewhere, children and youth must be treated differently from adults.
A lot of the debate we've had around sexual offender policy generally has been somewhat acrimonious at times. On one side, we have a group that is perceived by the other as being reactive, being overly punitive, being resistant to integrating evidence. We tend to talk about the fact that our policies, our public policies, are kind of knee-jerk reactions to these very extreme events, and I'm going to get into some of that. On the other side, those who are on the other side are often viewed as being soft on offenders and not quite in tune with reality. And this is a lot of the discourse that's kind of permeated our public policy discussion around sexual offending. And I want us to try to move a little bit beyond that. When we're talking about criminal justice-based policies, they tend to be mostly driven by statute. Okay? It's legislation that is passed. They have to be implemented down there. And we're talking mostly about criminal codes. In some cases, we have civil processes. I'll get into those in a minute. The public health and human services sector tends to be a little bit more kind of ground up. The innovations and the kinds of policies that we see, hopefully, and this is not always the case, but are mostly driven by kind of emerging programs, emerging practices, what works. And I will argue that it's a sector that is probably a bit more receptive and conducive to the implementation of evidence-based practice. When we talk in terms of the realm of prevention, mostly when we're talking about criminal justice responses, we're talking about what we call tertiary prevention. Okay, it's where basically something has happened, we're trying to respond and intervene, and the public health approach obviously comes at things from a very different angle, and the emphasis is mostly ideally, and this is what we're going to talk about a lot today, is primary and secondary. And then we obviously are working in different kinds of activity domains. Beginning in the early 2000s, we saw a sequence of legislation that began to put additional federal focus on this, and the states have kind of followed suit. Okay, so again, this is something that I think really began at the federal level, and states over the years have been passing very significant state laws combating human trafficking, and a lot of this has happened in very recent years. Second major domain where we see, again, what we would consider to be some form of prevention of the exploitation of children is in the realm of child pornography and internet-based sexual exploitation of kids. The child pornography laws date back to the 1970s, and over the years we've seen a sequence of federal activity where there's been increasing federal focus. I'm going to show you some data in a little while about the federal prison system and what's been going on there. But the prosecution and the disruption of child pornography networks has become a major initiative. When we take a step back and we look at these policies that really began in the 1990s, and we've seen, we're now about a quarter century in, we can kind of put them into two major kind of buckets. The first are what we call institutional strategies, and the second are community-based. Institutional strategies basically means locking people up, incapacitating them so that they can't harm anybody. Okay? As I mentioned, Washington passed the nation's first sexual predator civil commitment law in 1990. 21 states have followed suit, and the federal government followed suit in 2006. And the basic idea here is this is actually not the use of the criminal justice system. It's the use of the public mental health system to hold offenders after they have been released from custody. And the whole idea was that these were individuals who somehow slipped through the cracks, who needed to be held, and it's post-release confinement for these folks. Second way to obviously lock people, the second thing is obviously to lock people up, and we've seen some significant trends in sentencing for sexual offenders over the last 20 years. And some of these have crosswalked with broader sentencing trends that we've seen for violent offenders in general, but I'm going to show you in a few minutes how those who committed sexual offenses are somehow really kind of disproportionately affected. Longer mandatory sentences and sentencing guidelines have been put in place. We've seen a number of sentencing reforms. There's these laws called truth in sentencing, and the whole idea is that if someone gets convicted to 10 years, they should be serving 10 years or close to it. Okay, part and parcel to that has been a reduction in the ability for people to get parole. In the old days, it used to be people would go in front of a parole board and that would make a decision about whether they were due to be released. But what's happened is through legislation, the legislatures have very gradually chipped away at the discretion that judges, prosecutors, and parole boards have, and so a lot of this stuff is now codified into law. Now, are these policies good policies or bad policies? Well, this is kind of a matter of perspective, right? We've spent a lot of time trying, and this is a whole other talk, but we spent a lot of time trying to evaluate, from an empirical standpoint, whether these policies are working, and I think the jury's still out. Okay, there's a lot of evidence for and against, but we have to realize that the evidence is kind of just one part of the picture. Okay, we have these things like the concept of justice, okay, and who that justice is for is a really critical piece. And so this question about whether we're on the right path or not is something that we're going to need to debate and discuss. So where are we heading? So far I've painted a picture where we're talking about longer sentences, more monitoring and supervision than any other population, okay? And I think we can kind of put all of that into what we call a relatively reactive kind of punitive bucket, okay? Because what we really need to be doing is thinking about how all these elements can be integrated into a cohesive whole, okay? The fact that we always are going to be having justice responses that are kind of reinforcing our values and keeping kids safe. And those things can really work well in tandem with all these other kinds of things that we're going to be talking about today.
I want to thank everyone here today coming to listen to us talk and learn about our work. We really appreciate it. So as Elizabeth mentioned, I'm going to be talking about a new project that we are undertaking at the Moore Center that's focused on the commercial sexual exploitation of children and state responses to that issue, which are known as safe harbor laws. So just to give you a quick roadmap as to where we're going to go in this presentation, I'll give an overview of commercial sexual exploitation of children, also known as CSEC, because we all need more acronyms in our life. So if I say CSEC, that's what I mean. And then I'll go into a discussion of policy responses around the commercial sexual exploitation of children and how we are researching this at the Moore Center, and then future directions for this policy and our work. So what do we mean when we say commercial sexual exploitation of children? Well, one, we can think narrowly in the sexual commodification of children's bodies, right, for the purposes of monetary gain. In sort of general conversation, people refer to this as juvenile prostitution, right? So I find that term problematic, right? Juvenile prostitution implies that youth are able to legally consent to the sexual behaviors, right? Where if we removed the monetary aspect, we would call it what? Child sexual abuse, right? Commercial sexual exploitation of children is one form of child sexual abuse, one form of many. So the question of how many youth are involved is a very tricky question to answer. It is. The estimates that we have available vary widely. So we have estimates of 1,400 to 2 million. And the reality is the science around these estimates is not great. We simply do not know how many youth are involved in CSEC. But we do know how many youth come into contact with law enforcement, right? We're able to measure that. And it's generally in several hundreds, right? So in 2005, about 1,400 youth were arrested for juvenile prostitution nationally. And by 2012, that number dropped to around 600, right? So we're seeing declining numbers of youth being arrested for prostitution-related offenses. And so what's emerging now across states and across the country is an attempt to reframe juvenile prostitution as victimization and taking that out of the juvenile justice framework, taking the stigma of having contact with the system. We're trying to remove that. These policies are known as safe harbor laws. So states vary significantly in how they implement safe harbor. Safe harbor is sort of an umbrella term for dealing with CSEC in a new way that emphasizes the victimization of youth and not the offending behavior of youth. So how that occurs sort of varies between states, but generally in my review of the statutes, what I find are sort of three overarching philosophies, right? So one, an acknowledgement that youth involved in prostitution are victims, right? They're victims. They come from histories of physical and sexual abuse. They come from families marked by dysfunction and neglect. And they come from communities that experience disadvantage and poverty, right? So states are recognizing that kids in this situation are victims. They're also recognizing that sexually exploited children have current needs that far exceed the capabilities of the criminal and juvenile justice system, right? So they're currently experiencing violence. They're currently experiencing housing instability. And they are currently experiencing a host of physical health, mental health, and behavioral problems. And all of these things working together, the intersection of all these problems, exceeds the resources and the scope of the criminal and juvenile justice system. Some states are decriminalizing juvenile prostitution. So what they're saying is, we are no longer going to be arresting youth and charging them with prostitution-related offenses. Other states are relying on diversion. So either with decriminalization or instead of decriminalization. So some youth might be picked up by a police officer and taken immediately into social work or some other social service sector. Other youth in some states might be arrested, but then after arrest will be diverted into services. We've also seen in states that have implemented safe harbor laws an increased focus on access to social services. So trying to determine what the needs are of the youth, and they are many, right? So we see a need for substance abuse counseling, mental health treatment, housing services. So we see a variety of needs for youth. And so what we see is across the country, about 18 states are designated as safe harbor states, which mean that they have implemented some form of safe harbor policy. Now, California is a little different. California is not a safe harbor state, but some counties have taken the initiative to develop safe harbor policies within their jurisdiction. So Alameda County is one of them, that for the past several years have been working to decriminalize and divert youth into services rather than arrest. And other counties are now trying to use Alameda County as sort of a model county. But statewide, it has not been implemented. Maryland is not a safe harbor state. So states that have no safe harbor implementation means that they arrest as usual. Now, as I mentioned, there's extreme variation in the types of policies and how these policies are implemented within states. So if we just look at decriminalization, right? In some states, Tennessee, for example, they will not arrest a youth who's younger than 18 for prostitution-related offenses. So they do not arrest. So they've decriminalized juvenile prostitution. However, the youth is, once picked up by the police officer, is taken back to their home and given a pamphlet for services, right? And other states decriminalize but have a more formal system of providing access to services. We also see variation in age restrictions. So often there are age restrictions within states that decriminalize, and it usually matches the age of consent, but not always. So for example, Texas decriminalizes. They do not arrest youth for prostitution if the youth is 13 or younger. And so our goal is really to advance this literature. So in service to this goal, we have sort of three main research questions. First, we're sort of taking a 30,000 feet look. Nationally, we're seeing smaller numbers of youth arrested for prostitution-related offenses. So what we want to know is what is the trend, and can we tie it to federal legislation that's passed that has attempted to decriminalize juvenile prostitution? And has that policy been effective? Then, if we narrow our focus a little bit, we are working with several states that have implemented different types of safe harbor policies, and then also collecting data from states that have not implemented safe harbor policies to answer a key question. And that question is this: are youth protected by some level of safe harbor policy less likely to have another contact with the criminal or juvenile justice system than youth in states with no safe harbor protection? So the idea of safe harbor is to provide services so that they don't come back into the system. And so we're attempting to gauge how effective that is. And then finally, we want to know, in states that have implemented safe harbor, so getting a more narrow focus, in states that have implemented safe harbor, what has been the experience of the key stakeholders, the people on the ground, right? So within law enforcement, treatment providers, people within social work. What has been the experience? What are some of the barriers? How have they attempted to overcome those barriers? And then my final point today, which I think is sort of always our theme at the Moore Center, is that in talking about commercial sexual exploitation of children and safe harbor policies, the focus here is on after-the-fact responses. It's on reactions to offenses and abuse that has already occurred. And I think what we need to do, the conversation that we need to be having around commercial sexual exploitation, is that it is child sexual abuse. It's child sexual abuse. It's not a distinct element, right? It's child sexual abuse. And as such, it's preventable. We can prevent it, which means we need to focus our energy and our resources on prevention. And so I think that is the conversation as we move into the future that we really need to have around commercial sexual exploitation.
Thanks so much, and thank you for being here today. I will be talking about parent-focused prevention of child sexual abuse, and this is work I'm doing together with Elizabeth So this is work in development. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is around our work. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is why is it important to work with parents and some of the considerations for how to implement programs with a parent-focused prevention angle. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the curriculum that Elizabeth and I are developing and some of the next steps in this work to refine the program and evaluate it. So this figure is adapted from Bronfenbrenner's social ecological framework, and I put this up there to highlight how each of us as individuals is really embedded in a system of different levels of social ecology, right? So ranging from the close factors like our families to more distal ones like policy and culture. And our current responses to child sexual abuse really target different of these levels, but one area that's been relatively neglected are parents or caretakers of children. And we believe that this is a really important area to develop as a prevention focus, and a really comprehensive approach to prevention of child sexual abuse will need to involve multiple levels, but parents can be potentially a very important piece of that bigger picture. So we've already talked quite a lot about the justice system. One thing that's, I think, important to highlight is when we're thinking about prevention, most offenders don't have a prior history. So one study showed that over 90% of individuals who were serving time for child sexual abuse offenses had never committed any sort of related offense in the past. And repeat offenses are actually lower for child sexual abuse offenders than for other sorts of perpetrators. So it's important to keep that in mind, because although much of our efforts are going into working with these offenders, when we think about trying to prevent new cases, we need to be thinking more broadly, because we're not necessarily going to be impacting other folks who are at risk for offending. Another reason parents are so important is that they're so proximal, right? Parents are around, and most child sexual abuse, as we've heard, is perpetrated not by strangers, but by individuals who are actually well known to the family. So whether it's a step-parent, uncle, a friend, these are very, very common occurrences. And parents have a gatekeeping role in terms of who comes into the home, who spends time with the child. So making parents more alert to these kinds of issues can really encourage them to take different kinds of protective measures. So ideally, we would want to have a program that's flexible enough to be able to work with a very wide range of families. But when we think about where to start, families that are at higher risk are a very promising place to start. Now, there is no sort of robust risk marker for knowing when a family is likely to have a child sexual abuse occur, but there are some characteristics that have been associated with higher risk, and I've listed a lot of the most common ones up here: having only one biological parent in the home, fighting or violence between caretakers, parent substance abuse, low maternal education, poverty, lack of stable child caretaker bonds, maternal mental health issues and child sexual abuse histories, which has come up already. Child disability is also an issue that makes children very vulnerable, and research has shown that these children are at higher risk for being exposed to child sexual abuse. So in terms of the curriculum we've developed, it has 4 key sort of chunks or modules in it. The first is around basic knowledge. What is child sexual abuse and inappropriate sexual behavior with children? How can you as a parent help prevent them? And I should note that this is not only around prevention of one's child being victimized, but also if one's child is showing evidence of inappropriate sexual behavior with other children, how can one respond to that? Parts 2 and 3, in a way, are really the meat of this intervention, because this is the piece that we feel parents need more specific skills in than what they might be able to find online. And this is around communication, talking to your child, and safety monitoring. Finally, the fourth chunk is around making a report and how parents could go about reporting suspected abuse of their own child or another child. And there are a number of possible modalities that we're considering at this point. Again, these modalities are going to depend a lot on our partnerships with different organizations and the types of families we work with. Online training, as I mentioned, may be a way of reaching a lot of people very broadly, but with less individualized support. One thing that we're very intrigued by is the notion of online training with Skype feedback from a professional online, where parents could actually get some direct sort of real-time feedback on how they're doing with skills. One-on-one training is also an option, particularly with people who provide services to families, such as home visitors and advocates who often have really close relationships with families. And group formats are another way of reaching folks. So in summary, child sexual abuse, as you've already heard from others today, we believe it's preventable and that is an achievable goal, and that focusing on parent-based prevention strategies is a really promising way to move the prevention agenda forward. We believe parent-focused prevention can also ultimately be really well integrated with prevention approaches at the school, the community, and the society levels.
Good morning, and thank you, Elizabeth. I'm very excited to be partnering, collaborating with Moore Center colleagues, and I'll be telling you about our next project, which we hope will be funded soon and started soon. I'm going to shift gears and talk now about a focus on potential perpetrators. Our project is a primary prevention initiative that will universally target all school adolescents around reducing their risk to go on to be perpetrators of child sexual abuse. So when you think about what we're doing already, and this is a huge, important endeavor, there's lots of universal school-based programs, again, universal being trying to work with every kid, not just kids who are at risk, school-based, classroom-based universal programs that are focused on children as potential victims. So like Dr. Mendelssohn's work, trying to help the child in this case learn how to protect themselves from perpetration. And so what these programs tend to do is tell kids about the problem, help them recognize when they might be in a situation where this is happening, resist that from happening, and also to report it. So it's a lot of content around good touch, bad touch, just saying no and getting out of the situation and telling a safe adult if somebody tried to touch you in that way. Unfortunately, at this point in time, we don't know whether those approaches actually reduce incidence rates. That's really hard to figure out. But do the kids who have those programs end up being abused less because they've been hardened against, they're more sophisticated, right? Versus kids who don't have those programs. We really don't know if it's effective in reducing their victimization. I'm going to now run you through an idea for a primary approach, reaching kids before they've been show any risk. Okay, so we want to focus on early adolescence. This would be sort of a middle school population, and our reason for that is that adolescents are perpetrators in about 36% of all CSA reports. So these are police reports or Child Protective Service reports. The official data, it's a huge chunk of the perpetrators from what we know from the legal system. We know that most of those perpetrators are between 12 and 14 years old, and most are males. So most are male adolescents. Okay, so what would we potentially go after if we're going to try to bolster against this at the universal level? Nothing's actually happened with these kids yet, right? But I think if we look at the treatment literature, we can make some inferences about some targets here. So juvenile sex offenders have these kinds of problems that before they offend are probably leading the way to offending. So we know that juvenile sex offenders have lower sex knowledge, lower knowledge of developmental differences, so they just don't kind of get that younger kids are not the same as them. And they have other kinds of cognitive distortions, like, a child took her clothes off in front of me and that meant she wanted sex. Kind of related to the developmental difference thing. But when you talk to juvenile sex offenders, these are the kinds of things that come out about why these incidents occur. At the family level, Dr. Mendelson laid these out very well, that we tend to see families where there's not good communication about sex, where parents are not monitoring these situations where older kids are alone with younger kids. So here's what we want to do. We have an application in right now, myself with Dr. Letourneau and Dr. Bradshaw, to NICHD for a small pilot study which would involve 4 Baltimore City classrooms, sorry, I think it's 2 schools and 4 classrooms of 6th and 7th graders. Oh, sorry, 8 schools, right, 8 schools, 4 classrooms. And what we're going to do is we're going to target, hopefully target the health classroom, the sex ed classes in those schools, and randomize the classrooms to either receive our intervention or not. We're calling the intervention the responsible behavior with young children. Notice that the words perpetration, offending, and child sexual abuse are not a part of our title. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But this is a really relatively low-cost, manageable intervention, running about 10 weeks, 1 time a week in that sex ed classroom. 10 weeks to get through 8 modules of about 30 minutes each. I'm really excited about the parent piece of this intervention. We're going to try to keep it, it's primarily in the classroom, but we're going to have these homework assignments that will engage parents in this work. So the first thing, these are kind of scattered throughout the 8-week intervention. So we're going to have the adolescent go home and do a homework assignment where they make a roster of all the young children in their life, which is to begin to sensitize parents to the potential risky context that this adolescent has. It turns out this adolescent does do a lot of babysitting, or there are a lot of cousins around on the weekends, right? And so just to begin to understand the contacts that this teen is having with younger children. And then to begin to do applying some of the perspective taking and developmental difference stuff with actual kids in the teen's life. So the parent is going to facilitate some conversations about, yeah, your little cousin is really different, right? And we've talked about this. And eventually moving up to parents having information. The teen is going to teach the parent about child sexual abuse. So they're going to have their own myths dispelled around it, very similar to your curriculum, Dr. Mendelson, but the kids teach the parents about that. And then we're going to have parents facilitate a homework assignment where the parents make a strong expectation that kids not do this.
Well, I'm going to talk about what I think is a fairly delicate topic when it comes to child sexual abuse. And that's the issue of boys who are sexually abused who then go on to become abusers themselves. I'm going to do that by showing you a small taped vignette that I made actually about 32 years ago of a man who himself was victimized by his father. His father not only sexually assaulted him, but he was present with his father when his father would sexually assault other women, and this has been documented. He was clearly the victim of substantial abuse, and then he went on to become a victimizer, actually a serial rapist, the kind of person that would often be referred to as a sexual predator. To lay a brief foundation before I show you the film vignette, I just want to make 3 or 4 preliminary comments about, I think, some concepts that I think are important to understand. The first one is going to be how do we determine whether there is a relationship between being a victim and becoming an offender. And it's particularly important in this area where there's so much emotion and sadness and trauma. There are folks, when they hear about victimizers having been victims, they're fearing they're making an excuse, which is not what we want to do. But how do we make a determination whether that relationship is there? When I talk about this, I often talk first about the relationship between cigarette smoking and lung cancer, and then I'll make it clear why that's relevant here. If you look at everyone that smokes cigarettes and ask whether or not most of them develop lung cancer, if we don't remember this, it's important to think about it. The facts are that most cigarette smokers simply do not develop lung cancer, and if we stop there, we might think there's not much of an association. On the other hand, if you then take a group of people with lung cancer and ask how many of them are cigarette smokers, the overwhelming majority, particularly with the most common form of lung cancer, are smokers, so that when you put it all together, it's very clear that cigarette smoking is a significant risk factor for the development of lung cancer. If you look at a large group of children who've been sexually abused, the good news, and thank God this is the case, and particularly if they get help early on, is that the overwhelming majority of victims of child sexual abuse do not go on to become victimizers. On the other hand, to follow up on the analogy I just gave you, if you look at a large group of individuals who are sexual offenders and ask what percentage of them have been sexually or even physically and emotionally abused, the numbers become extremely significant. Now, the second conceptual point I want to make, because I said that this man became a serial rapist, is to say a couple of words about rape, because I think there's tremendous misunderstanding about rape, and we often talk about it as though it's just one thing. When a clinician such as myself looks at rape, we look at it from three perspectives. One, the behavior itself. Secondly, the consequences of the behavior. And thirdly, the motivation that led the individual to act that way in the first place. Now, in terms of behavior itself, rape indeed is always the same thing. It's one individual coercing another against their will into sexual activity. And again, when it comes to the consequences of rape, again, I'd argue it's pretty much the same thing. It's experienced by the victim as a horrible, unwanted, traumatic experience. But I'll put it to you that in knowing the behavior and knowing the consequences, we still don't necessarily know what motivated the particular individual to engage in that behavior in the first place. And there are a subgroup of rapists who are predisposed to engage in that activity because there's something fundamentally different about their sexual makeup. They are sexually disordered. And one of the ways in which a person can be sexually disordered, and I think it applies here, is that they've been the victim of child sexual abuse. Now, that's the next concept I want to get over to you is what is a sexual disorder? If you look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder for the primary mental characteristics of any sexual disorder, it will say that the individual with the condition experiences intense, recurrent, sexually arousing fantasies and urges about something, and depending on the particular type of sexual disorder, that something in pedophilia would be children, in exhibitionism about exposing oneself, and in the case of the individual I'm going to present here, about raping. What are the points I want to make here? It's such a short period of time. There's really just, I think, a couple. One is, I do believe this is a tragic example of what can happen to a boy who's been abused, and both emotionally and sexually, and where that's not recognized early on. One case, of course, doesn't provide compelling proof, but I doubt very much that he had a different type of a childhood that this would have happened. And given that he did have it, what a waste of his life, children who are deprived of parents, all the women who were victimized by him, just a terrible tragedy. And again, in terms of the points I want to make here, could it have been prevented? And this is what I want to stop with. I believe right now, as I stand here, there are large numbers of young people out there who are privately aware that they're having atypical kinds of sexual desires. We'll hear this afternoon about individuals who, as adults, are sexually attracted to minors. There are individuals out there like this individual who know that they're having fantasies and urges to rape. There's individuals out there who are worried, young people, 16, 17-year-olds, that they're not sure they can control themselves sexually. I'd put it to you, when is the last time any of us ever heard announcements saying, if you're a troubled adolescent, if you're having disturbing sexual thoughts, if you're concerned that you're going to lose control and hurt other people and ruin your own lives, please come in here before you cross the line. We want to help you. We want you to have a life. We want to prevent others from being endangered. We've heard it over and over here today. We pick up the pieces after the fact. We hardly ever do anything to try to intercede before the fact. I'm so proud to be a part of the Moore Center here. I think that's exactly what we want to now try to do, to see this as a public health issue. We're not decriminalizing, just as with drug and alcoholism. We want to fully support the criminal justice sector, but we've given so much lip service to prevention, to seeing these issues as a public health matter. I think that the work here is going to lead the way over the next few decades. Again, I'm very proud to be part of it, and I thank you very much for your attention.
So in 2012, I began working on a story about young pedophiles who want help battling their attractions, which I'd spend like the next 2 years working on. I feel for those of you who work in academia, 2 years on a project isn't that long, but as a journalist, it's a really long time. Yeah, and by far one of the most common questions I got throughout the 2 years I was reporting this is why? And that question was really simple to answer. I'd never heard of the concept of non-offending pedophiles before, and once I did, I was just I was really intrigued and I wanted to know more. The very first person I actually spoke with was Fred Berlin, who I think he spoke today. Hey Fred, how's it going? Because I was pretty green about this whole pedophilia thing. And so it was during this discussion that I learned that Elizabeth was establishing the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse, which is why it's so exciting to be here. And I gave her a call, and we just got to talking about prevention. And I feel that prevention, I mean, we're all in this room to talk about it today in many regards, but at the time, and in my experience, I'd never heard the word prevention used in regards to pedophilia. It was always the prosecution of sex offenders and not prevention. And so it kind of began what would become the 2-year project that involved gaining access to a group of undetected, self-identified pedophiles in their teens and early 20s, and kind of learning about what life was like for them. The reporting culminated in a story on This American Life and a print piece in Matter, and ultimately it posed 2 questions. The first was, could there be a better way to treat pedophiles who want help? And what can we do to help facilitate this? And also I discovered the extent of people's misconceptions about pedophilia, and more importantly, and I think that's something that may be interest to people in this room, it really taught me how it impacts barriers to getting help for people who genuinely want it. And so I want to talk with you today about what I learned about pedophilia, specifically as it pertains to young men and sometimes women in their teens and early 20s, public perception, and what I learned about the hurdles to accessing this help, kind of like a behind the scenes of my reporting.
And, I was just very nervous. I knew exactly what was coming. I'd known for so long, that I was going to walk in there and, what I was going to say. And, I'd rehearsed it in my head.
And what was this script you'd been playing over and over in your head?
I'm a pedophile, and I'm addicted to child pornography. And, I remember I walked in there, and, we started talking. And then, she kind of said, so what are you here for? And I said, well, I'm very anxious. And, she said, well, why are you anxious? And, my heart was beating. I'd never been so terrified in my life. But, I uttered the words. I said, well, this is difficult to say. But I'm a pedophile and I'm addicted to child pornography.
But lucky for Adam, his mother actually was supportive, and she got him a new therapist, one who was more equipped to deal with the situation. Though at the same time, whilst Adam had more success with the second therapist, for him it wasn't really enough. He wanted to speak to people he could relate to, which I think is a very human need. And he began to reach out to other young men and women online, and eventually, for lack of something similar, had kind of inadvertently formed a support group for pedophiles, self-identified pedophiles in their teens and early 20s. I'm going to play you one more clip, and this one's a little bit briefer. In this next clip, we're given a little bit more detail about how Adam's group functions. So again, sit back, this is like 2 minutes, so not quite as long.
At 17, Adam started searching online for other guys like himself. Young men struggling to deal with their attraction to kids, and some responded. They got to talking online, and soon there were a bunch of them communicating on a daily basis. Before long, Adam realised that he had inadvertently formed a support group for young pedophiles. Adam's group absolutely takes a moral stand. A few times, he's found himself trying to convince potential members of the group that having sex with children is wrong. And occasionally Adam has to turn someone away.
There was one time, someone came in, and he admitted to me pretty much right away that he'd done some sexual things with a 5-year-old kid, and right then and there I said, we can't have you. First off, they're a risk, but what's more is I think that I'll admit I have a bias. I think we are better people than those who go out and hurt kids.
Again, Adam created this group because there was nothing really available for him like this. And people tell me that I was brave to do this story, which I don't really buy. I think it's a bit bullshit, because I'm a journalist and it's a compelling story. And so I'm really thankful. And again, I know you're listening, Adam. Thanks again. I've said it a million times. But I think I'm just so appreciative of their trust in me. And it's just been a huge luxury as a journalist. But my biggest takeaway is they really want help. Many of these young men and women really want help. And many people in this audience really want to help. In our own ways, and I think there's like a wall stopping, preventing some of this help, and it's comprised of certain parts. One part is mandated reporting, and I don't have an answer, and I don't want to diminish mandated reporting because it's brought countless instances of child sexual abuse and neglect to light. I don't have an answer, but I think we need to keep talking about what we can do to help kind of bridge these gaps and have people who want help and want to talk, make them able to do that.
And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the project that we've been working on to try to address the needs of people like Adam, wherever you are, Adam. And, we talk about prevention, and typically when we frame prevention, we frame it as wanting to reduce the risk of harm to victims. And of course, there are many compelling reasons to focus on the risk of harm to victims. You've heard about the increased risks that child sexual abuse engenders for serious mental health problems like PTSD and anxiety and depression. Victimization increases the risk for physical health problems like hypertension and cardiovascular disease. It's one of the ACEs, the adverse childhood events, that shortens the lifespan. That's associated with a shorter lifespan. Being abused actually increases your risk for sustaining subsequent abuse later in life, in adolescence and adulthood. Boys under the age of 18 account for anywhere from 36 to 50% of all perpetrators of child sexual abuse. So this is a teenage phenomenon. It's a child phenomenon. And boys who don't offend, but who find themselves attracted to young children, that's a small percentage. We don't believe there's very many people who are preferentially attracted to young children. But for those people who there are, and particularly for the adolescents, they suffer enormously. These quotes are from quotes from discussions I've had with the young men that Luke put me in touch with. These kids go through adolescence with its normal ups and downs, but with this awful internalization of the stigma of being a monster. There is a model for this in Germany. The Prevention Project Dunkelfeld has been going on since 2005. And this is a project that actively reaches out to people who are living with sexual attraction to children and who want help for it, including people who have and have not ever offended. Dunkelfeld means dark field, and they envision this attracting people who are living in the dark field, particularly those who have offended but who haven't been caught. But it also is for people who have not offended and who don't want to. As I said, we envision an intervention. It's not developed yet, but we envision an intervention that meets the needs of youth attracted to younger children and who are committed to not acting on those attractions. And we see two broad areas of intervention. First and foremost, to ensure that these young people have the tools and the skills and the wherewithal to keep themselves and others safe by not engaging young children in sexual behavior. And of equal importance is to ensure that they develop the self-respect and the self-esteem that characterizes healthy and productive young people. We envision kind of 4 steps to getting through to the end of an intervention that we hope we can make available one day. And the first is to start with interviews with people like Adam, who's a consultant on this project, and others, to talk about what would you have benefited from as an adolescent? What would have helped you stay safe and be happier and healthier? And before Luke introduced me to Adam and several other people who were part of Adam's self-help group, I had never spoken to someone who was attracted to children but who had not offended. All of my knowledge across 25 years was based on doing research and clinical work with people who came to me through the juvenile and the adult criminal justice systems, people who had been caught, people who had already decided to offend. And that's true for my field. Almost everything we know is based on the people who get caught. We have very little understanding of the scope of folks who are out there living with these afflictions, with these unwanted attractions, and not engaging in harmful behavior. So the first qualitative piece is actually, we're gearing up to get that underway. We have an institutional review board proposal. They have a few questions for us, 15 questions for us. So I'll be meeting with them in a couple weeks. But our institutional review board at IRB has been wonderfully helpful and strong partner in all of our research at the Moore Center. So I'm confident that we'll get through whatever the snags might be. And we also need to really carefully design the assessment and the intervention pieces and the materials that we will use for outreach. At present, this is an unfunded project. We're looking to partner with foundations. There's, I don't believe at the moment, a government funding agency that would be willing to tackle this particular problem. But a couple of foundations have reached out to us. Nobody's signed a check yet, but we're hopeful that we can get some funding to at least get us through the first couple of stages. And then we think if we've got a decent-looking intervention with a little bit of feasibility behind it, we might be able to engage with some government funding agencies, and that's what it'll take. Feasibility studies are expensive, and randomized control trials are very expensive and unlikely to be funded without governmental support. I want to acknowledge the tremendous impact that Luke's reporting has had on this topic. He mentioned some of this, but I think it bears repeating. First of all, again, he really contributed just to my growth as a scientist and as a clinician by getting to meet and speak with now many, many people who are in the space of living with an attraction that they don't want and figuring out how to navigate it. He mentioned that millions of people have listened to the This American Life Help Wanted episode and read the Matter magazine article. He gets emails, hundreds of emails. I get hundreds of emails, phone calls, letters. Just the volume of the response is remarkable. I've been on NPR a few times and PBS and Radio Science and some pretty, some shows with large audiences. And most I've ever gotten is one or two people ever reaching out to me in the past. And inevitably, one of them supports whatever it was I said, and one of them hates it and is never going to fund NPR again or send PBS any money. And Luke mentioned the Moore Center and our work in the This American Life episode, and which is why people contact me. Maybe I've had 200 emails. We're actually tracking this, of course, because we're numbers people. And until recently, I could say that every single one of those had been positive.
Well, it's really exciting to be here because I've learned much more than, and I really would like to rewrite my talk, except I submitted my slides a week ago. But I think as I'm talking, you're going to get to see why this research reinforces the real importance of doing prevention as well as intervention. So the work I'm going to talk about today was based in a longitudinal study that we started in order to understand processes by which children with a sexual abuse history were at risk for developing problems, as well as who is going to recover more. And at the time we started the work, we knew that, yeah, this history was a risk, but there are a lot of children who didn't develop problems, or they developed this problem, not that problem. We didn't really understand the pathways by which children develop problems. It wasn't really what was happening. We wanted to start to understand really what the abuse meant to the individual, what was it like for them, and how they were processing and making meaning out of the events. So basically, the idea was, well, is it what happened or how the person understands and tells a story about what happens that really is important for understanding how they're going to do over time and who's going to do better and who isn't going to do so well. Okay, so there wasn't much work on this, especially in youth, because the sample I'm going to talk to you about were adolescents. We started with when they were children. At any rate, we knew that this is a hard thing to make meaning about, these events, right? So we know that the abuse violates core assumptions about the self as being lovable, worthy, about others as providing safety and care, and so that would turn the child's world upside down. We also know from work with adults that, at least in one study, 50% of them reported that they still hadn't figured out what these experiences meant for who they were and their relationships with others. Okay, so we know that processing CSA can be really difficult. You have symptoms which get in the way of encoding the different memories, such as PTSD and dissociation. You have some really quite negative emotions, fear, sadness, shame, and anger, which could make it very difficult to approach the material and try and make sense out of it. We also know, and we've heard earlier, that parents are really an important part of helping children scaffold, and for prevention is also, as well as intervention, to understand negative events. And yet work shows that, well, first of all, there are no common scripts that parents have for how do we talk about the fact that you were sexually abused, and that parents often worry that if I discuss this with a child, it's going to make things worse. And we know from developmental literature that parents are really key to providing that scaffolding to be able to self-regulate and talk about memories and make sense out of them. And these stories are windows into what we call representations. And representations are really, they're your experiences, your thoughts, your emotions about what's happened to you in the past, and how you put those together to guide your behavior about how you'll be the next time you either interact with someone or you're in a certain situation. They tell us about strategies people use for regulating emotion and attention to memories, and also narratives, which is the best way of getting at representations. They also can tell us about material that are out of awareness. So I could ask an individual, okay, oh, can you check on a scale from 1 to 10 how much you think you figured out what the sexual abuse has meant to you? And they might check a 9. Oh, I figured it out. But then when I ask them to sit down with me and tell me what happened. What was this like for you? How did you feel? How did other people react? That's much more effortful. And there's material that's going to come up during that discussion that the person might not even realize, and which could be very valuable for helping develop interventions. So what are the different elements that we know were from past literature that are important for both healthy and unhealthy processing? One of them is the regulation of attention to memories, emotions, and reactions. And you can see I have this organized in terms of constructive, so everyone will know that's the healthiest way of processing, and then there are 2 processing styles that are not particularly healthy. So the regulation of attention for the constructive processor is very balanced. They're willing to approach the material, but they can disengage with it. In contrast to that, the absorbed processor, they attend to the material, but they can't disengage, or they have a lot of difficulty disengaging. The avoidant processor has restricted attention. They don't want to really think about it, and so they really disengage from the material completely. Here's the shocker. We did not expect these findings. They were extremely distressing to us. So yes, we identified these kind of processing strategies in youth that we expected. Here's the distribution. Only 14% of our sample, 6 years after abuse discovery, showed us this constructive kind of processing. Now, if that isn't a huge call to prevention, I don't know what is.